What if the largest empire on Earth didn't fall, but was erased? Not by war, not by invasion, but by deleting it from history itself. This is not a myth. This is the empire they didn't want you to remember. The map that should not exist. A Tartaria Chronicle, London, 2019. The basement of the British Library was not cold because of the air. It was cold because of what it carried. Centuries of forgotten knowledge slept beneath the polished floors above. Books no one was meant to read. Maps no one was meant to see. Truths carefully buried under official history. Dr. Ethan Cole had spent his life chasing footnotes. This was the first time he felt like he was chasing a ghost. He checked his watch. 9:17 p.m. The library was officially closed. "You still have 10 minutes," the elderly librarian whispered, sliding a brown archival box across the desk. Box 117A, uncatalogued. Uncatalogued meant dangerous. Ethan nodded, pulled on white cotton gloves and lifted the lid. What lay inside was not supposed to exist. The map. It was large, hand-drawn and aged to a deep yellow. The ink had faded in places, but the lines were deliberate, confident, final. This was not a regional map. This was not Europe. This was not Asia. It was the world. And across the vast stretch of land from Eastern Europe through Siberia and deep into Central Asia, one name dominated the parchment. Tartaria. Not scribbled, not added later. Written boldly, as if there had never been any doubt. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. "That's not possible," he whispered. In every academic reference, Tartars were described as nomadic tribes, disorganized, scattered, footnotes in the rise of others. Empires had capitals, dynasties, records. Yet here it was. An empire that covered nearly a third of the known world. He looked at the date in the corner, September 39, and beneath it a seal. The Royal Geographic Society. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his phone. He took one photograph, then another, then a third just in case. The lights above him flickered, a presence. The basement was silent, but silence has weight. Ethan felt it before he heard anything, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. He turned. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no shadows. Still, the air felt wrong. He leaned forward to inspect the lower margin of the map, when suddenly his laptop screen went black. "No," he muttered, tapping the keyboard. The device was dead. When he looked back at the table, his breath caught in his throat. The map was gone. The box lay open, empty. A chill ran through him that had nothing to do with temperature. The death no one questioned. The next morning, the news called it an unfortunate incident. "Library guard dies of sudden heart failure." Ethan stared at the headline on his phone. The guard's name was Thomas Reed. Thomas was the man who had let him into the basement after hours. The man who had looked over his shoulder nervously and said, "Some things aren't meant to be reopened, Doctor." Now he was dead. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed staring at his hands. Heart attack at 46. Perfectly healthy. The map was gone. The witness was dead. And nobody was asking questions. The warning. That night Ethan received an email. No sender. No signature. Subject. Stop digging. The body contained only one sentence. Some empires are erased for a reason. Attached was an image. The same map. But this time a thick red cross had been drawn over the word Tartaria. Ethan closed his laptop slowly. This was no longer academic curiosity. This was a threat. 1721, the steppe. Snow stretched endlessly beneath a pale sky. Prince Arslan of Tartaria stood atop a ridge overlooking the city of Karabalik, its domes gleaming faintly through the frost. Behind him stood generals, scholars, engineers, not warriors alone, but thinkers. "Our strength is not in conquest," Arslan said calmly. "It is in knowledge." He planted his sword into the frozen ground. Empires rise by force. They survive by wisdom. His younger brother, Bekir, stood beside him, silent, watchful. The wind howled. Far to the west, foreign banners were already moving. London, present day. Ethan's hands hovered over his keyboard. If the map was real, then everything built on modern history was incomplete. perhaps deliberately so. He searched for Great Tartary. The results were predictable. Conspiracy, myth, fringe theory. Yet the map carried the seal of one of the most respected institutions on Earth. He opened his notebook and wrote one sentence. Who benefits from erasing an empire? Buried cities. Ethan began traveling, not as a professor, as a witness. In Moscow, he noticed buildings whose windows were half buried beneath the street level. In St. Petersburg, doorways that led downward, not up. In Rome, in Paris, in London itself, entire ground floors missing. Official explanations spoke of urban development and rising street levels. Ethan stood in front of a building older than modern Europe and whispered, "You were buried." The pattern. Everywhere Tartaria had once appeared on old maps, the same pattern emerged. Massive fires in the 18th and 19th centuries, floods that swallowed entire districts, reconstruction that erased what stood before. Libraries burned, records vanished, languages reclassified as folklore, history rewritten by those who survived, or those who conquered. 723. The betrayal. Prince Arslan returned to Karabalik to find the gates open. Not broken, opened. Inside, the city burned. Bekir stood at the center of the square, foreign soldiers at his side. "You gave them the knowledge," Arslan said, disbelief breaking his voice. Bekir's expression was hollow. "They promised order," he replied. "The world doesn't want freedom, brother. It wants control." Arslan drew his sword. He never had the chance to raise it. The last choice. Ethan sat alone in his flat, staring at the map image on his screen. If he published this, his career would end. His reputation would be destroyed. If he didn't, the truth would remain buried. His phone vibrated. Unknown number. A single message. Some histories stay dead. Ethan stood, walked to the window, and looked out at London. An ancient city built on layers of forgotten worlds. He whispered, "Not this one." End of chapter 1. The empire had been erased once. The question was whether it would be erased again. The Last Prince of Tartaria. A Tartaria Chronicle. The Steppe, 1723. The wind did not howl that night. It listened. Prince Arslan of Tartaria stood at the edge of the citadel balcony, his fur cloak heavy on his shoulders, his gaze fixed on the endless white plains beyond the city walls. Tartaria had no borders carved in stone. Its boundaries were understood, not enforced. Its strength did not come from armies alone, but from balance. That balance was breaking. Behind Arslan, the council chamber glowed with torchlight. Scholars argued in low voices. Generals traced lines across wooden tables. Messengers waited, frost still clinging to their beards. The empire felt it before it saw it. Change was coming. An empire unlike others. Tartaria did not rule through fear. Its cities were planned, not conquered. Roads aligned with the sun. Towers rose not as symbols of dominance, but as instruments of harmony. Bells were tuned to specific frequencies. Domes were built to amplify sound and silence alike. Knowledge was the currency of Tartaria. And knowledge, Arslan knew, frightened the world. "Western envoys have crossed the river," said Samir, Arslan's chief advisor. "Again." Arslan did not turn. "They always come with smiles," he replied, "and leave with maps." Samir hesitated. "They offer alliance." Arslan finally faced him. His eyes were calm, but tired. "They offer ownership," he said. Bekir. Prince Bekir, Arslan's younger brother, watched the exchange from the shadows. Where Arslan was steady, Bekir was restless. Where Arslan trusted balance, Bekir believed in control. "You underestimate them," Bekir said suddenly. "The world is changing. Empires are no longer built on wisdom. They are built on force." Arslan smiled faintly. "And they fall because of it." Bekir stepped closer. "Or they survive by adapting." The brothers locked eyes. In that moment, Tartaria's greatest enemy was not beyond its borders. It stood within. The foreign promise. Weeks later, the envoys arrived. They wore polished coats and carried letters sealed with wax. They spoke of trade, of modernization, of progress. They spoke of Europe. "We admire Tartaria," said Lord Ashcombe, a man with sharp eyes and a rehearsed smile. "Your cities are remarkable." "You admire what you wish to own," Arslan replied calmly. Ashcombe laughed lightly. "Ownership is such an old word. We prefer partnership." Bekir listened closely. That night Ashcombe met Bekir alone. "You stand in your brother's shadow," Ashcombe said, "but shadows disappear when the sun sets." Bekir said nothing. Ashcombe placed a map on the table, a world map without Tartaria. The first fire. The fire began in the Eastern District. Officially it was an accident, a storage hall, a careless spark. Unofficially it spread too fast. Towers collapsed, archives burned, bells cracked from the heat. Citizens ran, confused, terrified. Arslan rode through the streets, shouting orders, helping the wounded, watching centuries of knowledge turn to ash. By dawn the fire was out, but something else had been lit. Fear. London, 2019. Ethan Cole stood inside an old church scheduled for renovation. The guide spoke about Victorian architecture. Ethan listened to the walls. The pillars were older than the church itself, much older. He knelt and brushed away dust near the base. Half a symbol emerged, circular, precise. Tartarian. His phone vibrated. "Unknown number. You are following the wrong past." Ethan typed back. "Then why are you following me?" No reply. The betrayal. Back in 1723, Bekir made his choice. He opened the gates of Karabalik at night, not to soldiers, to historians, cartographers, men who carried ink instead of swords. By morning, Tartaria's story was already being rewritten. Arslan confronted his brother in the central square. "You traded our soul," Arslan said quietly. Bekir's voice shook. "I saved us. The world will not tolerate what we are." Arslan stepped forward. A shot rang out. Arslan fell. The empire fell with him. The last command. Before he died, Arslan whispered to Samir, "Hide the knowledge. Let them erase our name, not our truth." Samir obeyed. Libraries were sealed, symbols embedded in plain sight, cities partially buried to survive the coming rewrite. Tartaria vanished. But it did not die. Present day. Ethan stared at the symbol he had uncovered. It matched one from the map. Tartaria was not a myth. It was a crime scene, and someone even now was guarding the body. End of Chapter 2. Empires fall by conquest. Truth falls by betrayal. Chapter 3. The Great Silence. A Tartaria Chronicle. Eurasia, 1740-1880. The war no one remembered. Empires usually fall loudly. Cities burn. Kings are executed. Battles are recorded. Tartaria did not fall like that. Tartaria disappeared. And disappearance, Ethan would later realize, was the most sophisticated weapon ever used. After the prince. When Prince Arslan died, there was no coronation, no declaration of conquest, no foreign flag raised over Karabalik. There was only silence. Bekir was never crowned. There was no need. The envoys returned west carrying something far more valuable than territory. They carried permission to rewrite. The First Order. The first decree was not military. It was academic. Scholars were summoned. Cartographers were paid. Linguists were reassigned. Archivists were quietly replaced. No one was told to lie. They were told to simplify. Tartaria, the new record stated, was not an empire, but a loose collection of nomadic tribes. No capital. No system. No continuity. Just movement. Just chaos. And chaos, once written, became truth. The fires begin. The fires did not start everywhere at once. That would have raised suspicion. They began slowly. A library in Kazan, a record hall in Astrakhan, an archive in Warsaw, always at night. Always explained as accidents, oil lamps, faulty storage, carelessness. Yet the pattern was precise. Only old structures burned. Only pre-18th century records were lost. New buildings survived. New histories remained untouched. London, 2019. Ethan stood in the London Metropolitan Archives, scrolling through scanned documents. He had learned to look for gaps, not answers. And the gaps were everywhere, entire decades missing. Census records abruptly restarting. Architectural blueprints dated years after buildings were already standing. He whispered to himself, "You didn't rebuild, you rebranded." The archivist glanced at him. Ethan smiled politely and closed the file. He had learned another rule. Never let them know when you understand. The floods. In Tartaria, the destruction was more elegant. Water leaves no fingerprints. Cities along rivers were naturally flooded. Mud swallowed ground floors. Entire districts were declared unsafe and abandoned. When rebuilding began, the old foundations were buried, not removed. It was cheaper, more efficient, more final. Children grew up walking streets that were once rooftops. They never asked why windows were beneath their feet. Samir's task. Before Karabalik fell completely silent, Samir fulfilled Arslan's last command. He divided the knowledge. No single library would ever hold everything again. Symbols were carved into churches that did not yet exist. Mathematics hidden in ornamentation. Acoustics disguised as decoration. What could not be destroyed was camouflaged. What survives, Samir said to his students, must learn to hide. One by one they vanished into the new world. Builders, engineers, stonecutters. Their descendants would forget why they built the way they did, but the buildings would remember. The new maps. By 1800, Tartaria was gone from maps. In its place were smaller names. Russia, China, independent states. Borders multiplied. Control replaced continuity. When questioned, scholars shrugged. Empires rise and fall, they said. Nothing unusual. And people believed them, because the evidence was gone. Ethan's discovery. In Paris, Ethan found a journal. Not catalogued, not translated. It belonged to a French engineer who had worked on multiple reconstruction projects across Europe. One line was underlined. "We are not rebuilding cities. We are finishing them." Ethan closed the journal slowly. Finishing what? Or who? The cost of silence. By the mid-19th century, the silence was complete. Children were taught a clean history. Universities standardized the narrative. Doubt became unprofessional. Those who questioned were dismissed as romantics, or worse. Madmen. Tartaria had not been defeated. It had been forgotten. The message. Ethan returned to his hotel room late that night. The lights flickered. His laptop screen turned on by itself. A single sentence appeared. "You are standing on buried ground." He typed back. "So is everyone else." The cursor blinked. Then another message appeared. "Some foundations are not meant to be exposed." Ethan shut the laptop. Outside, Paris slept, unaware it was resting on another world. 1803, the final silence. In the last surviving Tartarian settlement, an old man carved a symbol into stone. His grandson watched. "What does it mean?" the boy asked. The man hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't remember," he said. And with that, the last living memory of Tartaria faded. The empire was gone, not with a scream, but with a whisper. Present day. Ethan pinned photographs across his wall. Maps, buildings, symbols. It was no longer a theory. It was a pattern, and patterns meant intention. Someone had erased an empire, not because it was weak, but because it offered a world that did not need control. End of chapter 3. Empires are destroyed by force. Civilizations are destroyed by silence. Truth is destroyed by agreement.
For nearly two centuries, the great empire of
Guardians of the Forgotten
Tartaria
World.
existed
A
only as
Tartaria
an
Chronicle.
absence.
Some
It
truths
wasn't
do
in
not
the
die.
history books.
They hide.
It wasn't
For
taught
nearly
in
2
classrooms.
centuries, Tartaria
It wasn't
existed
even
only
a
as
whisper
absence.
in our collective
Not in
memory.
books, not in
Yet,
classrooms,
over time,
not in
that
memory.
very absence
Yet absence itself began to form a shape. And shapes attract
as
watchers.
we know, attract
The ones who
watchers.
stayed behind.
When the empire
fell
finally
into silence, not everyone vanished. Some stayed.
Some
They
stayed
did not wear
behind.
armor. They
These
did not
weren't
raise
soldiers in
banners.
armor
They carried
or
no
nobles
names worth
raising
remembering.
banners.
They became
carried
builders,
no names worth
stonecutters,
remembering.
bell makers,
Instead, they
surveyors,
became builders,
architects who never signed
stonecutters,
their
bell
work.
makers,
They were the last
surveyors, and
Tartarians,
architects who
and
never
they
signed
understood
their
one
work.
rule better than
They
anyone
were the
else.
last Tartarians,
Truth survives
and they
only when
lived
it
by
pretends to
one
be
simple,
decoration.
unbreakable
Samir's
rule.
network.
Truth survives
Before his
only
death,
when it
Samir
pretends to
divided
be
the survivors
decoration.
into small,
Before
disconnected
his death,
groups.
the leader
No group
Samir
knew the whole
had
truth.
divided the survivors
No
into
bloodline carried the
small,
full story.
disconnected groups.
Knowledge was fractured by design, sacred geometry hidden in cathedrals, energy principles embedded in domes, acoustic science disguised as ornament. What is obvious is destroyed, Samir had said. What is beautiful is preserved.
Tartaria learned
And
to
so
wear
Tartaria
masks,
learned to wear
hiding
masks.
its genius in
The
plain
symbols
sight.
that shouldn't
Ethan
exist.
discovered
the first symbol by accident. It was carved into the underside of a stairwell railing in Prague. Perfectly circular, mathematically precise, too old to belong there. He began finding more. Rome,
This discovery
Vienna,
sparked an
Edinburgh,
obsession. He
Quebec,
began finding more
different
of
cities,
them in Rome,
different cultures,
in Vienna,
the same
in Edinburgh,
geometry.
even
This
in
isn't
Quebec.
influence, Ethan
Different
whispered.
cities,
It's
different
continuity.
cultures, yet the
Someone
same
had carried the same
unmistakable
knowledge across
geometry.
continents, and
This
someone
isn't
had ensured
influence,
it remained
Ethan whispered to
invisible.
himself one night,
The society
tracing
without a
digital
name.
photo of
Ethan
a
never
carving.
found their name.
It's continuity.
That was intentional.
Someone had
But he
carried
found
the same
references,
knowledge across
letters between
continents,
architects,
and someone had
marginal notes
ensured
in
it
engineering
remained
manuals,
almost invisible.
odd phrases repeated
Ethan
across
searched for the
centuries.
name of this
The ground
secret
remembers,
group, but he
stone
never
listens.
found one.
Silence
That,
protects,
he realized,
always
was
unsigned,
intentional.
always cautious.
What he did find
This was not
were
a
subtle
cult,
references,
not a conspiracy.
breadcrumbs
It was a
left across
custodial
the
order.
centuries.
Guardians, not
He
rulers.
found letters between
1847,
architects
the
discussing
bellmaker.
strange
In a small
shared
town near the
principles.
Alps, an old
He
man
found
tuned
marginal
church
notes
bells at
in
night,
old engineering
not for
manuals
sound,
and
for
odd
vibration.
phrases repeated
He struck the
time
bronze
and again.
gently,
The
listening
ground
not with his
remembers,
ears but with his
stone
body.
listens.
His apprentice asked
Silence
once,
protects.
"Why does this matter?"
These notes were
The old man
always
paused.
unsigned,
"Because
always
one day,"
cautious.
he said,
This wasn't
"they will
a
forget
cult.
why these
It
places
wasn't a
feel different."
conspiracy. It
"And
was
then?"
a
the boy
custodial
asked.
order.
"Then the
They
buildings
were
will remind
guardians,
them."
not rulers,
London,
dedicated
2019.
to preserving a
Ethan
legacy.
sat across from
Imagine
Professor
this.
Eleanor Shaw,
The year
a
is
retired
1847.
architectural historian.
In a small
She had
town
refused
nestled
interviews
near
for
the
20
Alps.
years. Yet she had called him. "You're asking the wrong questions," she said calmly. Ethan leaned forward. "Then tell me the right ones." She slid a photograph across the table, a cathedral floor plan, perfectly aligned with magnetic north. "This shouldn't exist," she said, "not with the technology of its time." "Who built it?" Ethan asked. She met his eyes. "People history calls primitives," she replied, "which is how I know that's a lie." The price of knowing. That night, Ethan's apartment was searched. Nothing was taken. Nothing was damaged. Only one thing was left behind, a small stone disc carved with the same Tartarian symbol. And a note, "We are not your enemies." Ethan finally understood. He was not being hunted. He was being tested. The bloodlines. The Guardians were not bound by race or nation. They were bound by inheritance. A grandfather who taught stone placement instead of prayer. A mother who insisted churches be built on certain ground.
They were
A
simply
father
told,
who refused
"This is
modern
how it has
materials
always
without
been
explanation.
done." And for
The children
generations,
never knew why.
that was
They
enough.
were told,
Ethan
"This is
learned
how it
that
has
in the
always
early
been
20th
done."
century,
And that was
a
enough.
final brutal attempt
The failed
was made
purge.
to erase
In the early
these
20th
last
century, a
remnants.
final attempt
Old
was
city
made to
centres
erase
were
the remnants.
demolished under the
Old
banner
city
of
centres were
progress.
demolished.
Historic
districts were modernized.
The elegant,
Symmetry was
harmonious
replaced with
symmetry
efficiency.
of the old world
But something
was replaced
unexpected
with
happened.
cold,
The
brutalist
buildings
efficiency.
resisted.
But
Foundations
something
collapsed when
unexpected
altered
happened.
incorrectly.
The old
Acoustics
buildings
failed
seemed
when
to
geometry
resist.
was ignored. Structures aged poorly when harmony was removed. Modern engineers blamed errors. The Guardians recognized punishment. Ethan's choice. Professor Shaw's final words echoed in Ethan's mind. "If you expose everything at once," she said, "they will call you insane." "What if I expose nothing?" Ethan asked. She smiled sadly. "Then Tartaria dies forever." Ethan walked through London that night, noticing the ground beneath his feet. Layers. Worlds stacked on worlds. He realized the Guardians had never planned for revelation, only survival.
He received one
The
last
invitation.
message.
Ethan received
It was
one last
just a
message.
set of coordinates,
No
nothing
explanation.
more.
He followed
No
them to an
explanation.
abandoned rail tunnel
He
beneath
followed
the
them.
city.
A mix
There,
of fear
carved
and
into stone,
excitement
blackened by
churning
time,
inside him.
was the largest
The coordinates
Tartarian
led
symbol
him
he
to
had
an
ever seen,
abandoned rail
and
tunnel
beneath it
deep
fresh
beneath the
chalk
city.
writing. You
There,
cannot unbury an
carved into
empire,
the stone wall,
but you can wake
blackened
its
by
memory.
time and soot,
Ethan
was
stood
the
still.
largest
For the first
Tartarian
time,
symbol
history
he
was
had
no
ever
longer
seen.
silent. It was waiting. End of chapter 4. Some empires rule through power, some through fear. Tartaria survived through patience, and patience Ethan now knew was about to end. Empire beneath the ashes. A Tartaria chronicle. Some truths are not discovered. They become a responsibility. Ethan Cole stood beneath London, facing the symbol carved into blackened stone. It was older than the tunnel, older than the city, older than the history written above it. This was not a ruin. It was a message, and it had been waiting for him. The final door. Set into the tunnel wall was a metal door without markings, without locks. Ethan placed his hand against it. The door opened. Inside, light glowed softly. Not electric, not fire. Memory. Maps lined the walls. Stone tablets rested on iron frames. Diagrams of sound, geometry, and resonance filled the room. This was a library, not of books, of understanding. A woman stepped forward. Her age was impossible to determine. "You are not here because we summoned you," she said calmly. "You are here because you could not stop." Ethan swallowed. "Who are you?" She smiled. "We are the ones who remained responsible after the Empire ended." The truth of the Guardians. Ethan was told what history never recorded. There had never been a plan to rebuild Tartaria. No intention to reclaim thrones. No dream of restoring flags. Because power was never the point. True power was proving that society could exist. Without debt. Without coercion. Without endless war. That idea, the woman said, is still dangerous. Another guardian spoke, his voice low. "We did not hide the truth out of fear," he said. "We hid it because the world was not ready." Ethan asked the question that mattered. "And now?" Silence filled the chamber. "Now the world is collapsing under lies," the woman replied. "And lies are always heavy." The real secret of Tartaria. Tartaria's greatest threat was not its technology, not its architecture, not its knowledge of energy. It was what it demonstrated. That control was optional. "We did not fight empires," the old guardian said. "We made them unnecessary." Ethan understood. An empire that proves people do not need rulers is more dangerous than any army. Ethan's choice. "If I reveal everything," Ethan said quietly, "what happens?" The woman answered without hesitation, "Your career ends. Your credibility is destroyed. The truth is labeled another conspiracy. And if I remain silent, then Tartaria truly dies." This was not a battle. This was a sacrifice. The final strategy. Ethan did not publish a revelation. He did not release documents. He did not expose names. He chose stories, historical fiction, architectural questions, documentaries that asked instead of declared. He turned truth into curiosity, because truth shouted can be silenced, but truth planted as a question cannot be stopped. The world responds. Some laughed, some mocked, some dismissed him, but others began to ask, why are old cities built this way? Why does this geometry repeat globally? Why do some places feel different? Architects noticed patterns. Students questioned textbooks. Ordinary people felt something shift. And the guardians watched. That was enough. The last message. Months later, Ethan received a letter. No sender. No address. Only one sentence. The memory has awakened. Ethan stood on a London street, staring at the ground beneath his feet. He knew an empire slept below, not to rise again, but to be remembered. Final scene. A child stood inside an old cathedral. He placed his hand against a stone pillar and paused. "This place feels strange," he said. His mother looked down. "Strange how?" The child frowned. "Like the walls are trying to tell me something." She smiled. The story had begun again. End. Tartaria did not return. It was remembered. They erased an empire, not because it was weak, but because it proved we never needed them. If this story made you question history, like the video and subscribe to Heroes of History. Want the next episode? Type next episode in the comments. Your support means everything. Until next time, Allah Hafiz. We'll return with another forgotten hero.